Grove last week. They really bled the militia dry to get these people to Jacksonville. Now, Marion had to often be in Jacksonville to make a quorum. The governor insisted. Greene wants Marion to provide security. After all, there are more than 8,000 British troops in Charleston, and 32 miles is not far. And Marion then spends most of his time in the House or in the legislature, while the militia, not too happy with defending Charleston anyway, because the people of Williamsburg County didn't much care for Charlestonians. They want to go home. The thing that really cemented the militia was Marion himself, and Marion's not available. And so we have a considerable amount of friction with the militia, and they sort of they melt away, I think is probably a good way to put it. In February, Marion does take over and is attacked at Tideman's plantation, and you heard about that this morning. The British had British regulars, British provincials, and Hessians. And Marion had Horry and Hans cavalry. And you heard about that battle this morning. It did not come out well, and Marion took a lot of casualties. He was not happy. He was not happy with Horry, and he was not happy with Mahan. Now in England, now the new Parliament has no confidence in Lord Cornwallis, none in Clinton, and they appoint General Guy Carleton, and to send him over to this country to get the British troops out of this area. Well, he doesn't get here until May. That's a long time after Yorktown. Now things are going well in Georgia. Antony Wayne forces the British to evacuate. Governor Rutledge orders Marion to Georgetown, and he signs an armistice again with Gainey. You heard about one armistice this morning that Peter Horry had signed, but then Thomas Sumter went out through that area plundering and set off the Tories again. So Marion now takes the surrender, really, of 500 Tories under Gainey. Now, the last battle Marion will fight will be at Fair Lawn on the 29th of August, when Major Fraser. Now, you need to remember Major Fraser because he was the commander who took Colonel Hay prisoner. And Marion had ambushed him at Parker's Ferry the last of August, just before the Battle of Eutaw Springs, and had killed 135 of Fraser's troopers, who were all South Carolinians, by the way, the South Carolina Royalists. So Fraser's in the backcountry, stealing beef, and Marion is coming back from Georgetown. And Marion ambushes Fraser and is doing extremely well until the horses of the ammunition wagon bolt and run. And Marion and his militia continue to inflict casualties on Fraser until their ammunition runs out. And then they retreat in good order. But this is the last time Marion will be in the field. He moved to Fair Lawn, and he remained camped there for the rest of the war. Now, on the 14th of December, the British are evacuating Charleston. The Council of Charleston planned the big celebration. No militia. Francis Marion and his militia were not allowed in Charleston even as spectators. Now, Walter Edgar writes in his history that the war in the South started and ended in Charleston, but it was not won there. It was won in the backcountry. And the militia had made tremendous contributions to winning the war, but they were not welcome in Charleston. Greene asked Marion to accompany him as his guest, and Marion is supposed to have said, no, he heard there was smallpox down there, and he'd never had it, and he didn't want to go. So he went back to Fairlawn, and he dismissed his troops. And he thanked them for 2.5 years of miserable service, really. You heard about that this morning. And he also said that if this unfortunate country was ever to be attacked again, he knew that they would come and do it all over again. Now, Marion went back to his home at Pond Bluff on the Lower Santee. Everything had been destroyed. He had no money. Francis Marion was never paid for his service. Neither was Andrew Pickens. Thomas Sumter did quite well, and we'll have Thomas Sumter explain all of that later. But Marion had to borrow in order to start to rebuild. He did have the command of Fort Johnson for a while, didn't stay there too terribly long. Now in 1786, Marion, now in his 50s, married a cousin, Mary Esther Eutaw. And according to the locals, that marriage was a very stormy one. I don't see that particularly in the research, but we live down in that particular area, and you hear all kinds of things. One lady said to me, well, no wonder they didn't get along. She was Tory, you know. And I don't know if that's true or not, but you hear a lot of things from these ladies. But she had money, and he was able to rebuild his plantation. He became a planter, especially successful with indigo. He continued to be a legislator, but he was not a particularly successful politician. He wanted people to live in peace, no matter what side they had been on. He supported free education for this state, and that wouldn't happen until the middle of the 20th century. He died the 26th of February in 1795, and he's buried in the cemetery at Belle Isle, his brother's plantation. It's down by Pineville, and I think probably most of you have been there. Marion was a soldier who had fought in the French and Indian Wars. He had commanded troops at the Battle of Sullivan's Island. He had been a competent leader in an attempt to retake Savannah. When the state was occupied by the enemy, he accepted the command of the Williamsburg militia and continued with the war from the swamps. When the Continentals returned, he continued to fight as a member of Greene's successful campaign. When Governor Rutledge established civil government, Marion helped implement that agenda. Marion was a team player. He commanded when a task confronted him, and he obeyed the orders from both Greene and Rutledge. And he was a major player in the fight for independence. Now, there are many accolades. One on his tombstone that the state wrote, the politicians wrote. But the one I think is most moving and telling is this. When I consider how much you have done and suffered, and under what disadvantage you have maintained your ground, I am at a loss which to admire most, your courage and fortitude, or your address and management. Certain it is, no man has a better claim to the public thanks than you. History affords no instance wherein an officer has kept possession of a country under as many disadvantages as you have. Surrounded on every side with a superior force, hunted from every quarter with veteran troops, you have found means to elude their attempts and to keep alive the expiring hopes of an oppressed militia when all succor seems to be cut off. To fight the enemy bravely with the prospect of victory is nothing, but to fight with intrepidity, under the constant impression of a defeat, and inspire irregular troops to do it, is a talent peculiar to yourself. Nothing will give me greater pleasure than to do justice to your merit, and I shall miss no opportunity of declaring to Congress, the Commander-in-Chief of the American Army, and to the world the great sense I have of your merit and services. And this is signed by Major General Nathaniel Reed. And that is Francis Marion. Thank you.
I wish I could say it were a pleasure to be here, but it is not a mission of pleasure that brings me here today. First of all, I trust everyone can hear me. Is this true? All's well, good. I apologize for my speaking voice not being its usual loud self, and I hope this will compensate sufficiently to allow me to carry a few ideas at least across to you. Now, it has been said that I am uncooperative. It's been said that I was incompetent. It's been said that I was a plunderer. And I suppose anybody's entitled to his opinion on these matters. But opinions ought to be based on something. And they ought to be based on something other than other opinions. I would think a look at facts might be something that everyone ought to do before forming opinions and not after. And so I'd like to acquaint you with a few things that somehow it seems that many people have somehow forgotten. On the first charge, for example. One scholar has even said that my severe wounded at Blackstock's, November 1789, was the greatest gift the Revolution ever received. Put me out of action for 2 to 3 months. Somebody asked why I wasn't at Campions. You might think about that. Some scholar has even said that I was never a team player. Well, I thank God I was not. But first you ought to ask what team I was playing for. The Constitution of the United States of America was written in 1787. It was ratified in 1788. It went into effect in 1789. In New York City, I was there. I was a member of the first Congress, though I opposed that Constitution. I think many people who look back at this time look through the lens of that Constitution. It did not exist during the war. The order of things that that Constitution established did not exist during the war. I need to calm myself. My voice is getting worse when my indignation elevates a little, so bear with me. I have here a copy of some extracts from the Articles of Confederation. You need to know that the Continental Congress was never a legitimate government. It was never intended to be a government. We never meant to have an American government. We had 13 American governments working together for purposes of common defense and related topics. 13 governments. But by default, simply because some things had to be done if the war was going to be fought the right way, by default, Congress started becoming a government, or at least like a government. And as soon as that happened, people who've always tried to seize government for their own ambitions started trying to use Continental Congress for that purpose. And nothing restrained them. There was no constitution. There was nothing that provided any limits to any kind of government, whatever. It didn't exist as a government, so it couldn't be treated as a government in almost any sense of the word, except to try to support the war. And you all know how indifferently that success was. 1777, members of Congress wrote the Articles of Confederation. Excuse me. This was an attempt to give a government, to create a government of some kind, and to establish proper limits to it, and to establish just what the proper relations were between the states and the Congress. Now, it still never gave us a president or a king or anything like that. It had no judiciary. All it had was Congress and the 13 states. And here how it begins. By the way, 1777, not approved until 1781. Think of these dates in relation to South Carolina. March 1781, just before Greene comes back into South Carolina. Up until that point, he's operating even without the cover of this. Such operation as he does here before he leaves the first time. Article 1. The style of this confederacy shall be the United States of America. Not the country. The style, the name, the title, that's all the United States of America was. The style of this confederacy. And that's the only way you use that term. 13 states when they all work together. Article 2, listen carefully. Each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, independence, that's for those of you that don't listen any better than you read. You know what independence means? Every state retains its independence. Mr. Greene never read this. Or if he did, he read it just so he could find ways to get around it. There's more, but that's basically the essentials of it. There's more I can say about this, but that's a very important point. In May of 1780, Charleston fell, and with it the state of South Carolina ceased to exist except in the person of John Rutledge. Prior to the investment of Charleston, the legislature had voted full power to Governor Rutledge. All legislative authority belonged to him. There's a couple of exceptions, but none of any importance to what we're talking about. Now, what I'm talking about here. It was to Governor Rutledge that I reported. Colonel Tarleton had the bad sense to burn the house I was staying in. I had an idea. I guess if you want some background, you might know where I get some of this, but I'll get to that in a minute. It was Governor Rutledge who gave me the commission and the mission to come back into South Carolina because he had fled to North Carolina just before Charleston fell. I was South Carolina at his dictate. I was commissioned by him, ordered by him, authorized by him. What I did under his authority, which was the authority of the legislature, which was the legal authority of the state of South Carolina. I think that's a pretty good team, and I think that's a pretty good indication of the team player. But make no mistake, South Carolina was and remains my team. South Carolina within a proper union, of course. After all, I did participate in the Congress. Against the Constitution, I still work with it. I know which way to go, but I don't win. And it's not to pick up the ball and go home. I followed the orders of my governor. I reported to my governor. I kept my governor informed. His orders to me were first to embody the militia and to create a presence to dominate the ground. The stuff I hear about Nathaniel Greene clearing or liberating South Carolina is irksome. It didn't depend on battles. If it did, Greene failed spectacularly. All this time I hear you trying to convince somebody that Eutaw Springs was a victory, and if that's the best you can do for an entire campaign in an entire state, then you don't really have much to try to defend. Compare this to military leaders of past times. No question whether they won or not. This whole thing about winning battles reminds me too much of a game anyway. War is not a game. It's a very serious business. Even this question of rules of warfare, which I at one time adhered to and thought about and believed in, but under the pressure of combat, that evaporates easily. Only those who have not been there can speak so easily of it. Those who have been there and still speak of it have my admiration and my respect, because they know. No, it's not about who holds the field. Not this kind of war. No, it's not about who had the fanciest maneuvers. No, it's not about whose uniforms were prettier. It's not about who had the fanciest tactics in the field. It's about, at the end of the day, where are the loyalties of the people? British never held South Carolina. The Tories were not British. They too were South Carolinians. Some of you have noted already that there were some discrepancies here between people that originally fought on the right side and then turned and fought on the wrong side. Well, I knew some of them. I know some of them still. I'm in a business partnership with one of them right now, by the way. It's Sam Times. I know Sam Times at times, and I know why he's doing it. I know why he did it. I know even why Andrew Williamson did it. And it's not because they love the king. It's because they love South Carolina. I can't speak for everybody. But look at the circumstance. Look where you find yourself. Look what you're working with. Colonel Murray's brother. That's not a traitor. He may look like it if all you're looking at is rules in the book. That the British had. A few people enthusiastically loyal, but most making their own decision about what's best for them in their state and how effectively they can do the best they can for it and for themselves and their families. And I don't think most of them cared much about the king. The great majority of people that I know about, now I recognize I move in a lot of different circles in this state. The great majority of those I've ever known just wanted to be let alone by everybody. Whether they wore blue, red, homespun, walnut dye, whatever. Just be let alone. But that couldn't happen. It was the mission of the people that I led not to attack British positions unless they left an outpost hanging, relatively undefended. I knew what I was leading. I wasn't leading British regulars. regulars. It's our mission to control the ground, to make sure that the people know that there is a presence in South Carolina, and they don't need to believe all the swill that the Tories are spreading around about how the revolution is finished, about how the King's men are in total control. And we did that. I think we made it pretty clear that the King's men were never in total control of South Carolina. So that when Greene does come back in, he has to worry about the regular army. But I don't think he had to worry that much about people on the ground. Now, he wanted to. You see, Greene's one of those people that never liked that document. I learned a lot about this when I went to Congress. There's always been an element that I didn't know anything about. It was all happening in the northern states. An element in Congress, an element in the Army. This talk about politicians interfering with the Army is missing the point, too. I have never known a more political institution than the United States Army. The agenda, when I heard someone talk about, yeah, Greene had an agenda, all right. Greene's agenda was to reduce South Carolina under control of Continental Congress. It was to make the states not sovereign, not free, not independent, but components of a bigger part, controlled, not coordinating, but controlled from Congress. Quickly, when they found that this wasn't doing what they wanted, those are the people that tried to give us this new Constitution and have succeeded. And if you pay attention to what they are doing now that they have got this Constitution, and now that they, not Greene anymore, be his soul rest in more peace than he allowed others to. If you see what they're doing with it, I think you see the plan. Greene was part of that same plan. He wanted it to be Greene who liberated the state. Greene who protected our freedoms. Greene who saved us from the British. The stories that his people would tell about what happened, you'd never believe he lost every battle except the closely lost one at Eutaw Springs. And in fact, he did, but the state still retained its character. The British regulars withdrew. And that left the citizens in the middle, one effective choice to go to. Greene wanted to make sure that they were the only effective choice. Gratitude would be turned into votes, votes into money, money into more votes. And he would get his subdued South Carolina. By that point, I had little to do with that. I followed the orders of my governor. I followed the orders of my government. I was the servant of my government. But about a month before the battle of Eutaw Springs, Governor Rutledge came back into the state. At which point I no longer was the embodiment of South Carolina. He was. Made his camp with Nathaniel Greene. And as far as I can see, whatever Greene told him to do, he did. And I know Rutledge well. He's a man of uncertain temperament. He's a man who moves his mind around a lot. I call him a weathercock. Like on top of your palms, like whichever way the wind blows, he turns. It became obvious to me after a while that the thing about Rutledge was he'd back you up until somebody else talked to him. He usually supported the last person to talk to him before he signed something. He'd tell you, we're going to do this, then somebody else would say, that's not wise, and he'd think and say, well, maybe you're right, and he'd do something else. Let me give you an example. Let me just not be talking out of my head. Somebody mentioned Kings Mountain. Not long, not long before the Battle of Kings Mountain, James Williams showed up in my camp. Now, James Williams was a militia officer, worked under Andrew Williamson. He waved around this piece of paper. Had been commissioned by Rutledge, 2 things: colonel in the state militia and commander of the entire militia. Every other militia officer reported to me in theory, including Marion, Pickens, Hardin, all of those. I never pushed that much. I was more concerned with whether the job got done than with who was getting credit for it. And they were doing well now. Colonel and commander. Williams shows up waving a commission as a brigadier general, which Rutledge had given him. Never telling me it had been done, never giving me any orders that my command was being superseded. So I just picked up my commission and waved it right back at him. And he said, well, I'm a general and you're just a colonel. And I said, but I'm the commander and you don't have any such thing on your orders. He was going to take my men and take them all to Kings Mountain. And while I didn't have any objection to that, I do need to know where the lines are. I need to know who's being legitimate and who's not. So I withdrew from command, not to give it to him, but to go see Rutledge and ask him to straighten it out. He made the mess. Now, another thing about me is that most of my men were not my men. They were Ned Lacey's men. They were Brandon's men. They were later Hampton's men, Billy Hill's men, Richard Wynn's men. I called up colonels. I didn't call up men very often. Sometimes I could, but I would usually call on colonels. They called up the men and brought the men. And I told them, if y'all want to follow Williams, fine. I no longer have apparently the legal authority to order you. But I'm going to see something about this. And I went to find Rutledge. And several of my colonels did go with James Williams to Kings Mountain. My men were there, some of them. Some chose not to. They had other missions that they already had gotten by way of Rutledge, by the way. I went and found Rutledge. Rutledge said, oh, no, I never meant for you not to be commander. I just made him a general, but you're still supposed to be the commander. So by now, thinking I knew Rutledge pretty well, I asked him, would he mind putting that in writing? So he wrote me out another set of orders and says, here, this will prove it. Made me a brigadier general, too. And me commander, even though he made Williams the general first. Now, I don't know where this might have gone. Williams was a hard-headed man. I don't think he would have let it lie. But that became a moot point when he fell at Kings Mountain. And there was never any other question for a time, at least, about who was in command of the militia forces of South Carolina. Greene was never in my chain of command. Greene was never my commander. I reported to John Rutledge. Period. So don't accuse me of team player, obstacle. It was good that I got wounded so severely at Blackstocks. That utterly misses the point. You think I should have been following those orders like that? You think I should have been Greene's subordinate? But until Rutledge came back into the state, if I had subordinated myself and my authority to that of Greene, I would have been giving up South Carolina's independence. I would have been subordinating South Carolina to Continental Congress. And I did not have that kind of authority. And I had no mind to seize it. Rutledge could. And when Rutledge came back, I started backing off of that. This is why I was no longer so active after about that time, right around the first part of August of 1781. I no longer had the same role to play. And by then, Rutledge was basically working with Green. He told me, do what Green says. Okay, now I start doing what Green says. Francis Marion did not have that problem. He had a bigger one. The Bible says no man can serve two masters, but he did. I think he did it rather well, but it did cause some strains between us. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Continental Army. When his regiment was captured at Charleston, he did not cease to be an officer in the Continental Army. When the British sent forth all their people to try to get everybody to take an oath of allegiance, they were looking for him, they were looking for me, they knew my record, they wanted my name on that thing. He went away and reported to the nearest Continental Army commander, who happened to be General Gates, which is exactly his duty. As a Continental officer, that was his duty. But Gates sent him down to take charge of some of the militia in South Carolina. Excuse me. This is before I was commissioned. This was real quick. He was put in a very difficult position. The men he commanded didn't really have to obey him. And he knew it and they knew it. They followed him out of something other than legal compulsion. I know the man was frustrated. I know he tried to resign a couple of times because he couldn't get his men to obey. He couldn't get his men to stay. Marion was not a guerrilla or partisan, a militia commander. Marion was a Continental Army officer, a professional. He considered himself such. I think he always wanted to stay such. I don't think he ever wanted to be the swamp fox. I think he did great service to South Carolina and to the nation as commander later of the 2nd South Carolina. A professional military organization, by the way, let me point this out. When the Provincial Congress created those 6 South Carolina regiments, 3 first and 3 later on, they were not militia. Oh no, I was in the Provincial Congress. South Carolina was creating a professional, regular army. Militia is every able-bodied male citizen free with a gun. It's an obligation of citizenship to serve in the militia. No such thing for these units. They didn't have to be Americans, South Carolinians, anybody. 1st and 2nd recruited who knows what off at docks at Charleston. I was happy to have North Carolinians. I commanded the 6th. My first big command in South Carolina was commanding what we then called the 2nd Regiment of Riflemen. When Continental Congress put a quota on the states to create a bigger Continental Army, they asked for 6 regiments from South Carolina, and we just turned over our 6 professional regiments, and they became Continental Army regiments, and they got all the officers were given Continental Army commissions, including me. I was a lieutenant colonel, commander of what became the 6th South Carolina. And I kept that commission until 1778 when I resigned it after that horrible, absolutely botched and disorganized mess in Georgia. We might get to that a little later. Besides, all our units, Colonel O'Ree referred to that today this morning, all of our units had been gone. This is one thing, it does keep you calm. I need that, particularly in light of some of the things I've heard. All of our units have been so badly mangled, most of them not for any good reason, but don't get me started on Georgia. That Congress said it was too expensive to maintain them all and ordered some of them merged. First was to be my 6th and Marion's 2nd. By now, I was a full colonel in the Continental Army. I had been promoted. Marion had not. logically you'd think I would be the one to command the merged regiment. I was not.